welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The Today Show not long ago mused that if you need some inspiration for your reading list, check out Ana Huang, the #1 New York Times best-selling author, known for her propulsive, dark, and steamy new adult romance novels. While People magazine has crowned her a book talk phenom, and E! Online has asserted that the author is in a premier league of her own when it comes to romance novels. Cosmopolitan, in a cover story on her runaway success in the past few years, recently reported that the author of the Twisted series, which played out over twisted love, twisted games, twisted hate, and twisted lies, just got another New York Times bestseller, and she's not slowing down anytime soon, remarking that it's weird to say that it's only been a few years since Ana Huang first burst onto the scene as one of the biggest romance writers in the game. In a genre that's filled with so many legends like Julia Quinn and newfound loves like Jasmine Gilroy, Casey McQuiston, and Megan Quinn, Ana has carved out a path of her own. Like many other writers, she started off in the indie space and has since broken her own kind of ground thanks to the massive success of Book Talk and the boom in the romance scene. It's easy to write it off as a mix of luck and chance, but it's far from that. The former social media creative used her skills to her advantage to build a fandom that's unlike any other, and things are just getting started. Ana's already announced her plans for 2025, which will include the next book in her King of Sin series, which played out over the King of Wrath, the King of Pride, the King of Greed, King of Sloth, and the King of Envy. Ana knew the Gods of the Game series, over the Striker and the Defender so far. She's equally revered among fans for her debut series If Love, where they first got to know her over If We Ever Meet Again, If the Sun Ever Sets, If Love Had a Price, and If We Were Perfect. USA Today recently broke the news for fans hungry for even more that while Huang's best known for her Twisted series, the aforementioned steamy sports romance follows a top soccer player and former prima ballerina. While in some Good Morning Americas rounded out the praise with their own note that her impressive resume of books has been translated into over 24 languages, with millions of copies sold worldwide, sitting on the New York Times bestseller list for multiple weeks. And she takes out time today from her busy schedule to talk about it all. Ana, welcome to the show. Years before you were on the New York Times bestseller list, what sort of stories could we have found you reading and maybe even writing as a child?
It was pretty mixed. But I actually got into it because I needed to learn English. So I was born in the US, but my family didn't speak English in my household. So when I went to school in kindergarten and first grade, I had to take English as a second language classes. And then my mom, she told me, and I didn't really know it at the time, like what that meant, because I was the only Chinese student in my class. And so my mom, to speed up the process, she was like, why don't you write me a short story in English every day? And I actually didn't know at the time it was supposed to help my English. I was like, wow, she really loves to read my stories. And so that's kind of how I got started. And she has always really nurtured that part of me. Like she would take me to the library every weekend when we had free time instead of the mall. And so I grew up surrounded by writing and books. But I also loved movies. I loved TV shows. We would watch TV shows together as a family. That was what we did like every night. And so I was surrounded by all the storytelling so it was very natural for me to kind of create my own stories as I got older.
Well, you were attending high school and then Harvard University. Any academic minds you count as guiding lights inspirationally or as an influence as your writing journey advanced?
I was one of those kids that it sounds so nerdy, but I liked a lot of my teachers. I wasn't one of those kids that was like, oh, like teachers are weird or anything. But I remember the first one is probably when I was in fourth grade. And we would do, like essay assignments and story assignments and things. So I had submitted this story just for a class assignment. And I didn't know it at the time, but the teacher actually submitted that story to a county contest to get published in like a magazine for all of like these children in this county that they thought had like great storytelling. And so I ended up being chosen as one of the slots in that magazine. And it was such a surprise to me. And I was like, oh my God, like I had no idea this was even a thing. But it was, I think, probably the first moment where I kind of really thought like, oh, this could be something that I could do. And I really loved her for doing that because she didn't even tell me, I think, just in case, right? Like she only let me know after it was selected. And then in high school, I think honestly, all of my English teachers, like my AP English teacher, I think they were just so passionate about their jobs and so open to kind of encouraging that love of reading and books in their students, no matter what they wanted to read, that it was really inspiring for me as well.
Now, People magazine in a cover story would spotlight your path to publishing as one that's been unconventional, to say the least. Where Huang didn't pursue writing as a primary career at first. Her parents encouraged her to do something, anything more financially stable, so she kept writing on the side as a hobby. She shared her work on the social reading platform Wattpad, which encouraged her to keep writing. Her perseverance paid off. In 2020, her romance series became the first romance series to blow up on TikTok, with over 1 billion views to date. Platforms like BookTok, where young creative readers can share their annotations, create imagined text conversations between characters, and even act out scenes, has been a boon to indie authors like Huang. Nearly 4 years later, she's considered one of the best-selling romance writers of all time, per Bookright. Wow. Turning the page back in time before all of that, to your first series, If Love, where readers first became acquainted with Blake and Farah, and If We Ever Meet Again. Where did you initially in your own imagination as you began writing and building this incredibly interactive fan base?
I actually never started with short stories beyond what I wrote when I was in elementary school. I had always been more of a novel person, like a full-length fiction novel. But it's funny because when I was in high school, I used to think, oh, I really only want to do this for myself. Like writing was a creative outlet for me. It was therapeutic for me. But at the time, I think I was still very scared of putting my work out there like myself. And so I was like, oh, like I don't want to be an author because who wants to be judged in that way? And so I just started writing all these stories secretly, like on my computer. But then when I went to college, that was when I really saw kind of a boom in those like online story sharing platforms. Like they had Fiction Press when I was younger, and then it went to Wattpad, and then now we have AO3. And so I thought, well, maybe if I was anonymous, I could just kind of see what other people think. So I did end up writing this sort of young adult story that I put up on Wattpad when I was like in 18 or 19 that I had written when I was in high school. And to my surprise, that actually took off. It like went viral on the platform. But I still didn't think I wanted to be a professional author at that time, but it was a really great way for me to kind of hone that skill and start creating a community, I think, in the book world.
It's fair to say demand for this series would not stop once it first began reaching readers, inspiring a prolific output on your part of 3 more full novels within the same year over If the Sun Never Sets, If Love Had a Price, and If We Were Perfect. Reflecting back now, how autobiographical do you feel this was versus future novels to come?
It's interesting because I think the If Love series is very different. That was my debut series. And I think it's very different from what I write now. I had actually drafted the first version of that series also when I was in college, but I had changed it quite a bit since I published it in 2020. And so basically it follows a group of friends. So the first 2 books are a duet, so they have to be read together. And then the next 2 books in that series are standalones. And they follow this group of friends who meet when they study abroad in Shanghai, which was inspired by my own experience because I had also studied abroad in China in college, both in Beijing and Shanghai. And I think even though those are romances, I think those books are very heavy in kind of coming of age, kind of that sense of freedom that you feel when you are living abroad for the first time, you're independent for the first time. So the themes of friendship and finding yourself and kind of growing up and transitioning from college life to your early 20s are very heavy in that series, I think, compared to some of my later books. And, they always say we put the most of ourselves in our first book. And so I think that is probably true for me as well. Do I think at one point we have to write what is the stories that we feel are true to ourselves. I think especially as authors, we get so much feedback, right? Like we get feedback from editors, we get feedback from readers, and God, don't get me started on Goodreads. But like, and so everyone has an opinion on their work, and a lot of it, a lot of times are conflicting, right? And while I do like obviously all of my editors and my alpha and beta readers, I do take their feedback into account. And sometimes I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Like this is something I should change. But then there's other times where I'll get feedback where it just does not feel right. I'm like, I understand where you're coming from, but to me as the author, this does not feel like it is right for my story. And I have to kind of learn basically to parse what advice I take, which is actually, I think, a very important skill as you not like get into this industry. And then I would also tell people to know what the reader expectations are for what you write. And it's like if you write a romance, right? Like the most basic thing, if you write a romance, there has to be a happily ever after. Like, do not categorize it as a genre romance. If there's no HEA, don't be like, I'm going to reinvent this genre. Like the genre does not need reinventing. And if you try to publish a romance without an HEA, the readers are going to be extremely unhappy. And I think in terms of whatnot, I always think of this. I'm like, you have to have a thick skin as an author. And I think it does get better as I publish more books because when I had like my first one or two books, I was like stalking the reviews. Like every single time there was a review, I was like, oh my God, like I have to know what people say, right? And now I try to avoid it as much as possible because it just gets too much into your head. So it's learning to kind of put a little bit of separation between yourself and the books, because after you publish it, it's like, well, I can't change it now, like either people are going to love this book or they're not, and not every book is for everyone.
As you dared from there further out onto the cutting edge, USA Today spotlighted just how far you'd push the boundaries of the romance genre in the process. As the clock is ticking until fans of Ana Huang's steamy Twisted can see their favorite complicated love interest in the flesh, Netflix acquired the TV rights for the dark romance novels that reign over the spicy section of Book Talk in a seven-figure deal. It's safe to say the show has built-in audience with over 12 million copies sold in translation rights in 34 countries. With Variety adding the impressive factoid of the series, this series has been a fixture on the New York Times bestseller list for 60 weeks and counting. How did Alex Volkov and Ava Chen first begin to steam up the page here with the right balance of romance and suspense and twisted love, to then let you know you had a winning concept on your hands, to follow up with bodyguard Reese Larson and Princess Bridget von Ashburg in Twisted Games, then Dr. Josh Chen and law student Jules Ambrose in Twisted Hate, and finally between Kristen Harper and Stella Alonso in Twisted Lies? And once again, how did you feel writing in a compressed time span?
Alex and Ava were the first couple that popped into mind when I was kind of brainstorming the Twisted series. But I knew going into this series that I wanted it to be a series. I wanted it to be 4 books. Don't ask me why, but I have this thing with the number 4. My first series was also 4 books. And it basically follows a group of girlfriends who are friends in college. And I had wanted to do that because in that subgenre, in new adult, I think you see a lot of friend groups that are based around groups of guys, and you don't see a lot that are based around girls. And I really wanted a series where we can kind of showcase very strong female friendships that are not about them being in competition with each other or them being jealous of each other, just like very healthy friendships that follow them as they fall in love, but also there's like a little bit of suspense and like a little bit of a darker themes in those books. Um, but I hadn't developed all of the girls in that series until I was writing Twisted Love. Like I knew Alex and Ava, and then the rest I kind of explored as the story unfolded. It's about the relationship dynamics, I think. And tropes are also a very popular thing in romance. But for me, I think the most important thing is the conflict and the dynamic. Like what is keeping them apart from each other? What is the growth that they need to go through as a couple? And those have to be different, right? Because it's like in Twisted Love, yes, it's a brother's best friend, but then he also has this sort of like secret revenge plot against her family, which is very different from book 2, Twisted Games, which is more of like a forbidden romance, right, between a princess and bodyguard. And so every time I go into a book, I always start with the characters first. And while I think the characters always have, maybe they have some similarities, each of them are very unique in kind of their backgrounds, their emotional wounds, and what they need to overcome to become like the person that is open to love at the end of the story. Twisted Lies it was a very unique experience for me in several ways. One, it was the last book in the series, so obviously there is a little bit of a melancholy there. Also a little bit of excitement, I think, because I'm like, after this, I can start a whole new world, right? But it was interesting because Twisted series for me was my breakout series. And so before that, I had never experienced this sense of being like, for 2 years, all I had ever really talked about with my readers, all I had ever really posted about were these characters. It was like I was in this world and they were like all I knew. And so it was very sad to say bye to them in that way, but also kind of terrifying to be like, well, once I end this series, like, are they going to follow me to my next series, right? And I think that is every time we start a new series, that is always a fear, I think, for a lot of authors. It's like, well, they loved these books, but what about these other books that are coming up? And I felt a lot of, and I did feel a little bit of pressure to be like, well, this is the last book and I have to make it, I have to make it live up to expectations and all of this. So I had a lot of emotions while writing that book.
Boy, would they follow you and buy the masses into the next new series you introduced us to on the page within the Kings of Sin, which inspired Good Morning America and their coverage to paint a portrait of the style you are becoming known around the world for as new adult and contemporary romance with deliciously alpha heroes, strong heroines, and plenty of steam, angst, and swoon. And oh, would they over King of Wrath, King of Pride, King of Greed, King of Sloth, and King of Envy. What from the pure potential of the plethora of places you could go within a series starring billionaires was most appealing here, and at the same time exploring the deficits that each set of co-stars, novel in and out, face amid the classic money can't buy everything adage, and everything else you would with Dante and Russo and Vivian Lau, Cao Young and Isabel Valencia, Dominic and Alessandra Davenport, Xavier Castillo and Sloane Kensington, Vuk Markovic and Iena Kadane, and other co-stars that ultimately unite to then grow together. And how does it sound as they're bantering back and forth with each other while you're writing away?
Yes. So King of Wrath, it features an interracial romance. So the main character, Vivian, is Chinese American, and the hero, Dante, is Italian American. And I think even though the Twisted series did feature Asian leads, so Ava in Twisted Love was Asian, and so was Josh in Twisted Hate, I think King of Wrath was the first book where I kind of leaned into it, into, for example, the kind of cultural differences that can come into a relationship when you have those two clashing cultures, right? It's like part of the book, and part of Vivian's personal arc is that she has to learn how to stand up for herself and push back against her family, who were the ones that pushed her into this arranged marriage with Dante. Because in Asian culture, the concept of filial piety and listening to your elders and not talking back to your elders is a very, very strong concept, right? Like it was ingrained in us basically from the day that we were born. And that's very different from someone like Dante, who grew up in a culture where I think there was a much more heavy emphasis on individualization. And he gets so frustrated because he's like, why can't, like, you are so strong and like you speak your mind when you're with me. So like, why can't you do the same for your family, right? And I think for that, it was easier for me because I am also Chinese American. So I understand kind of the cultural nuances that come with having family dynamics like that, and then how to deal with it when you're dating with someone outside of your culture. But when I am talking about other books and representing other cultures that I am not a part of, I always try to get input from people who are of that culture. So for example, Isabella in King of Pride is Filipino Chinese. And then Alessandra in King of Greed is Brazilian. So I always have alpha readers who are of that ethnicity or culture, provide very detailed feedback on the ground, and just making sure that it's authentic and respectful of those cultures. King of Pride is also a little bit of a forbidden romance because she is a bartender at the club where he is a member, and they're basically not allowed to fraternize with the members, right? But I think that is actually probably one of the more wholesome stories that I've written, in the sense that, he wasn't morally gray and they just had a very kind of loving, healthy relationship. And then King of Greed was something also totally different because that was a marriage in crisis book. So, and it's different from anything I've ever written because at the beginning of the story, they were already together. They've been married for 10 years. So King of Greed was a story of how, people can grow apart even after being married for so long, even if they actually do love each other, which they did. And then trying to kind of find themselves again after so many years of marriage and kind of losing themselves in work and what things are supposed to be but weren't. And so it's kind of like a second chance as well. And so I think it was easier for me because the dynamics were so different between those two couples. So King of Sloth, it is kind of like grumpy girl, sunshine boy kind of romance, or as they call it now, it's like a black cat, golden retriever kind of dynamic. And so she is Sloane. She is Javier's publicist, and he has always been kind of this like billionaire, like playboy that never really did much with his life. But then there is a family crisis that basically forces him to step up to the plate. And it throws them together because they have to work very closely together. So it's like they find out things about each other, they fall in love, but also it's about him growing into the person he can be, I think, as opposed to the person he has always been. It's fascinating because it's always played like a movie in my mind. Whether I'm reading it or writing it, like I just see it in my mind as it would play out on a screen, and I hear the dialogue as it would as if I were watching a movie. And so I always thought it was how everyone read books, but then it wasn't until I got older where I was like, oh wow, like people experience words in a much different way than I do. King of Envy is the fifth book in the series. I am very excited for it because I think it's going back to my roots a little in that the main male character is probably a little more morally gray after a string of heroes that are a little bit more wholesome in King of Pride and King of Greed. And so I think that one will have darker themes as well. And then King of Gluttony, I have not fully plotted that out yet, but that will definitely, like as a foodie, I am very excited for that one. Expect a lot of food descriptions. Who knows? It could make it into one of the spicy scenes. You never know. And then we actually have King of Lust also, which is going to be the seventh book. So I am one of those people that actually thrives under deadlines, in hindsight, right? Because when I'm actually in the deadline, I'm like, why did I ever do this to myself? Like, this was such a terrible idea. I never should have announced this book before I finished writing it. But I think in the long term, I actually do thrive under deadlines because I'm not sure if you're familiar with Clifton Strengths, but it is a strengths test that basically tells you like what your top strengths are. And my number one is intellection, which basically means I need to think a lot. Like I just think a lot. And so it's hard for me when I'm on deadline because I would just sit at the computer and it would take me like 2 hours to write a paragraph sometimes because I'm constantly just going back and deleting it. But without that pressure of a deadline, I could just be sitting there for like years, just thinking on this book. So I need that in order to push me. And yes, I think sometimes the pressure can be a little debilitating in the sense that because now it's not just me and my story. Now I have all these other outside voices in my head being like, and I think the one of the downsides, I mean, there's a lot of upsides to having interconnected books, but I think one of the downsides is that because readers have already been introduced to these main characters in previous books, I think a lot of times they will go in with a conception of how they feel like the story should already be, right? And so I'm always writing being like, oh my God, like, are they expecting something else? Is this like a different story than what they wanted? And so I have to really learn how to tune those voices out. Otherwise, I would just get like paralysis.
Now, how did it feel to become a New York Times bestseller so early in your career? It's like the Mecca milestone for any author to reach.
Oh my gosh. A little surreal, and it's so funny because when the notification, so King of Wrath was the first book I had that hit the New York Times. And I was actually in New Zealand at the time. I was traveling. And when the news came through, I had just hit this like no cell phone zones. I had no service. And so I was like, I was just like going on my tour bus off to like Milford Sound. And then all of a sudden I got service again. And I had like 30 missed messages from my agent. And at first I was like, oh my God, what is wrong? And then I found out I hit the New York Times and it was so, I don't know, like I couldn't quite believe it, you know what I mean? Especially because I was in a foreign country. So it kind of just felt like I was very like in a whole different world. But I'm very grateful for it. And, I couldn't have done this, I think, with all of the readers and my publisher and everyone. And it's been an amazing journey.
Could you give fans a bit of a look at your character sketching process, so to speak, as you're first meeting new ones in your imagination? Say, for instance, those who would star in the Gods of the Game series, kick off The Striker, where the Today Show importantly noted that you've moved on from the world of billionaires and into that of professional sports. Or Asher Donovan's a star footballer in the Premier League. After a major loss and a controversial team transfer, he's forced to bond with his former football rival turned teammate during off-season training. former ballerina Scarlett Dubois. What first drew you into the world of professional British football is the perfect backdrop to set this new series in. And how exciting are all the romantic possibilities creatively when they're first flying at you as you're beginning to write?
I always say that my books are steamy, but they're not erotic, right? So erotic romances tend to have a lot more sex scenes. I generally tend to have maybe about 3 to 5 in my books, which seems like a good balance for me. And I actually write them all separately on their own. So when I write the story, I'll just be typing along, and then if I hit one of those scenes, I'll put a placeholder and I'll come back to it. One is because they're actually the hardest scenes for me to write. And then two is because I require a different, I guess, state of mind to write them. It's like hard when I'm writing like a very emotional, sad scene and I have to like jump into a sex scene. It's very hard for me. And yeah, I have also learned to always write them at home. Not in the dark, but just at home because I've tried writing once in public and I think I scarred my next door neighbor at the table for life. I'm very excited for The Striker. It is my first ever sports romance. It follows an English Premier League footballer or soccer player, as they call it in the United States. And, you know, football/soccer is the only sport that I enjoy writing. So I am super excited to delve into this world. And it's set in London. So it's my first ever series that is set there. It does follow Asher Donovan, who has already shown up in the Twisted and Kings of Sin series, and he's kind of like the world's greatest footballer, right? But there's more that goes on behind the scenes.
Beyond the first, what can fans look forward to in The Defender and then the rest of the series to come?
It'll be a new series. It'll be 3 books. And every book will follow a different player in the Premier League. I didn't get a chance to tour the stadium, but I was in London in early March, and my publisher was kind enough to get me tickets to one of the Arsenal games. And so I was able to go and watch a game for the first time in real life, and it was pretty amazing and actually very helpful because I'm like, wow, this is so much more different than seeing it on TV, a lot more exciting. And you know, English football fans are very, very enthusiastic. So it was a great experience. But you know, I don't know if David Beckham or anyone happens to be watching this and wants to give me an interview, I would be open to that as well.
Finally, your book signings these days, to say the least, are quite an event. With Variety recently pointing out that on top of her impressive publishing footprint, Ana Huang boasts an impressive following on social media, with several 100,000 followers on Instagram and TikTok, and billions of views on posts across each platform. What is it like when you meet and get feedback from your readers on how your books have impacted them, whether it's a pleasure read on vacation, or maybe one that helped them through something more serious like a hospital stay?
I love it when they say that they connect to these characters or they're like their comfort characters and all of these things. And it's because as a reader growing up, I understand where they're coming from because when I was growing up, I would read books where I just felt so like even though I knew they were fictional, but I felt so connected and so seen by certain characters that I felt like they actually existed in real life, right? And they were a great solace for me, I think, in harder times. So to be able to provide that same level of comfort to the readers, I think is one of the best parts of the job. And, you know, and sometimes they'll be like, you know, have certain conceptions of who a character is, but and while as an author, creatively, sometimes I'm like, well, this is a lot of pressure for me. But who am I to tell them that they can't interpret certain things certain ways, right? Because everyone's reading experience is different. So it's definitely a fine line. But at the end of the day, I write what I write. And when I put it out there, I can't control how people interpret it. And I don't think I want to because different things mean different things to people. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to the story and connection, right? It's like for me, I always say the way I think about it, I'm like, if I like something, I bet you there's probably other people and a lot of other people in the world that like the same thing, right? Because there's no one thing in the world that is just particular to one person. And so I try not to chase trends that are not for me. So there's certain types of subgenres and certain tropes that are very popular where I'm like, this is great for them, but I know for me as an author, I would I would not be able to do them justice because I just don't enjoy them, right? even if the people who write them are making a lot of money. And for me, it's about sustainability because I still want to be happy and fulfilled in this job. Like, I don't want to just do it being like, well, I'm going to do something I don't like just because it's going to make me money, you know? And then also connecting with the readers. Like, I try to always, like, I can't respond to every comment and every message because there aren't enough hours in the day, but I try to acknowledge at least most of them as much as I can, because to me, they may be one of like 100 messages, but to them, it's like this is the one message that they're sending to like their favorite author or the author of their favorite book. And so I think it's important to create that type of relationship as well. Just knowing that it's was able to help someone is honestly because I think writing is such an isolating profession. We're sitting at our computers all day, and yes, there's online reviews, and which I try to avoid now, online reviews, and there's comments and things like that. But I don't think any of that beats the experience of meeting someone in person and they tell you like, wow, like this book helped me get over, like my brother recently died and this book really helped me get through those hard times, or this really made me feel seen and represented. Because it's I think it's one thing to know that abstractly, and then it's another to have it be real. And it's, I think, probably one of the most incredible feedbacks that I could get as an author.
Anna, it's been a pleasure talking today. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Appreciate it.